Okay, so today we finally finished Descartes. We're going to go through Meditation 6 and finally learn about the fate of the material world. Does the material world exist? Do physical objects exist? At this point, Descartes has not yet established that to his satisfaction. Okay, he's proven that he exists. One thing he could never doubt: I think, therefore I am. He's proven, at least to his satisfaction, that God exists and that God would not deceive him. But he's still not quite sure that that tree out there exists. Maybe it's just he's experiencing it and he feels like the tree that he's staring at exists, but he could be mistaken. And so now we have to get to Meditation 6, and the title is Concerning the Existence of Material Things, and also concerning the mind and the body, that they're distinct. In fact, let me get to my slideshow here so I can be more accurate with my title. So this, according to our translation, this is the title of the sixth meditation. Concerning the existence of material things. We talked about the essence of them in the previous meditation. Now we're going to prove their existence. Descartes sets out for himself. And also the real distinction, the distinction between the mind and the body. Okay, so that's ostensibly the topic for Meditation 6. So let's just review very briefly here. We've got, this little cartoon we were looking at last meeting. Basically, you could argue that at this point, in Meditation 6, it's almost like Descartes is in a similar scenario as he was in the first meditation, when he was thinking that perhaps everything was a dream. So at this point, all he knows is his thoughts are real, those he can't deny, and that God exists, and that God was not to deceive him. So he's got to bridge this gap somehow between his experience of the world, the representations in his mind, as it's labeled in this cartoon, or what he calls ideas. He wants to bridge the gap between his ideas and the world of external things, if there is such a thing. At this point, he doesn't even know if there is an external world. He wants to believe this. He does believe it, but he doesn't have a philosophical proof for it. Until he does, he's in a bit of an embarrassing moment, and he's stuck pretty much in the same situation he was stuck in when he thought that everything was a dream. All he knows for sure is that colors exist, shapes exist, but for all he knows, they're all just in his mind. So he wants to get out of that, and he's going to do this, you're going to see, by basically, where are we at here? Sorry. He's going to do this basically by thinking about the distinction between the imagination on the one hand and how that differs from the intellect. And this is not quite obvious what this has to do with material things, but I promise you it'll get to that eventually. So he begins the sixth meditation by contemplating this. What is the imagination? How is it different from the intellect? And when we uncover this, when we find out what the intellect actually is, this will offer us a clue that will bridge that gap between my experience of things and the actual things themselves. So let's begin here by actually just reading the opening paragraph from Meditation 6, and then we'll get straight about all these different, functions, aspects, I don't know what you'd call them, aspects of the mind, aspects of the self, the cogito, to use his word, the thinking thing. I think this is on page 47. Yeah, 47 is the page number if you have our textbook. And I'm just going to just read right from the beginning of Meditation 6. Descartes writes, "It remains for me to examine whether material things exist. Indeed, I now know they can exist, at least insofar as they are the object of pure mathematics." Okay, that's a callback to the previous meditation. Remember, last meeting was kind of a doozy. I guess we covered a lot of stuff. We covered not just the fourth and fifth meditation, but I screwed up and I skipped the second meditation. So we had to go back and cover all that stuff. So you might be sort of like, a bit discombobulated as far as sort of the order of everything goes here. But what he's doing here when he says that physical objects can exist. It's at least possible they exist, as insofar as they are the object of pure mathematics. Again, this is a callback to Meditation 6, where he's looking at the essence, not the existence, but the essence of material things. And he seems to conclude that the essence of them is what we know about them mathematically. Whether or not there are actually triangles in the physical world, whether there actually is a physical world, I actually can imagine a triangle, and there are things that are true about the triangle that don't depend on me. I can't make it so that a triangle has 4 sides. I can't make it so that a triangle, it's the biggest angle inside of it is across from the biggest side. I can't change that. That truth is just true. And so since he's established that, he says, well, that's pretty good indication, a pretty good indication that it's at least possible that those physical things are real and that they exist apart from me. Insofar as they're the object of pure mathematics, I can understand their mathematical qualities, and those don't depend upon me. And since I clearly and distinctly perceive them. Now, this notion of clear and distinct ideas is something that I feel like I have underemphasized so far in our exploration of Descartes. And that's probably my bad, because this is a pretty, you might say it's a pretty important point for Descartes. He uses this phrase quite a bit throughout the essay, you might have noticed. Clearly, distinctly. If I know something clearly and distinctly, clear and distinct ideas. At this point in the essay, by the time we get to Meditation 6, Descartes feels like he's firmly established that anything that he knows clearly and distinctly must be true. How does he establish this? This is something we kind of skipped over. My fault. I probably should have focused on it as we were going along. There's always so much going on in this essay that I want to make sure I get the important points. But I put this off too long. It's time to stare the monster in the face. Stare the animal in the head, right? I can't remember what that stupid expression is, but you know what I'm saying. Why does he use this so much, and why does he say that it's so important? Why, if I know something clearly and distinctly, why is that so unassailable that you can't doubt it, okay? Well, it begins with the one thing he knows for sure. So way back at the beginning of the essay, at the very end of the first meditation and the beginning of the second meditation, once he's established that he can never doubt his own existence. Once he knows that I think is always true, the statement, the proposition, I think, is always true anytime it's uttered, he pauses for a moment and he's taking stock of this one thing he knows for sure. So this is before he moves on. This is before he proves God's existence. He says, well, geez, all right, I've established this one truth. I've established the truth of the cogito, the thinking thing, which I am. I can never doubt it. So let me think about what makes this knowledge so special. I have this knowledge or belief, at least in my body, but I also, and that could be doubtful, but I have this certainty about the mind. And what is it about the mind that is so different from all these other things? And he seems to think that it's the fact that it's clearly and distinctly known. In other words, when I say that I'm thinking, I know clearly what I mean. I know what thought is. I experience it at all times. It's clear what I mean. And when I say that I must be thinking in order to exist, it's very clear and obvious that that's true. And it's distinct. There is no other being besides myself that I'm referring to when I say I am. I'm unique. Descartes also thinks that God is a clear and distinct idea. The notion of God is clear and distinct, right? There's only one being that answers. It's clear what we mean by God. You could argue maybe that's not the case. I would say perhaps I don't think we really do clearly know. But he says, well, clearly God means an infinite, perfect, all-knowing, all this other stuff. The list he gives us of all the attributes of God. So that's clearly what we mean, although are those things really clear? But let's just give him that. It's clear and it's distinct. There's only one concept like God. So this leads Descartes into some problems. In fact, some would argue that it involves him in circular logic, the famous Cartesian circle. And so let me explain what is happening here and why some commentators are so critical of Descartes with this move. So remember what I said. He comes up with this this criteria pretty early on in the essay. Once he establishes the truth of the cogito, and once he realizes that the thing that's so special about that truth is that it's known clearly and distinctly, he surmises that, hey, I guess anything I know clearly and distinctly must be true. But he pauses for a second. He says, well, maybe it's possible that I know something clearly and distinctly and it's still false. Maybe the evil genius is tricking me and making me think that something is true because it's clear and distinct. It still isn't true. So I need to prove that God exists. And that leads him into the third meditation, where he offers a proof for God's existence. And so, all right, now that I proved that God exists and that God is not a deceiver, I can go ahead and go with my first assumption, and I can believe anything that is clear and distinct. So if I know it clearly and distinctly, it's got to be true. So again, the cogito, the certainty of himself, leads him to postulate, come up with a criteria, a standard, clear and distinct, got to be true if it's clear and distinct. Oh, wait, maybe that's not a good criteria. Maybe I'm mistaken about that. Got to prove God exists. If I can prove that God exists, then I know clear and distinct ideas are absolutely true and undoubtable. Now here's the problem. In the fourth meditation, the fifth meditation, the one that we covered last time, he seems to use the clear, distinct idea of God. You could even argue he does this in the third meditation with the mark of the craftsman. He says, how can I have a clear, distinct idea of God? How is it possible that I have this idea in my mind? Well, there's only one way. God has to exist to put that idea there. Also, when I say, I know God has to be existing because it's part of his nature. I have a clear idea of God, and God's perfect, and you can't be perfect if you don't exist. So this clear, distinct idea of God leads me to a proof for the existence of God. This is circular. If you don't follow me, I know it's kind of confusing, but just think about it this way. I'm going to keep repeating this, and hopefully it'll settle in. He needs God to exist in order to be sure that clear and distinct ideas are true. But yet, he uses a clear and distinct idea in order to prove that God exists. All right? Clear and distinct ideas prove that God exists. God proves that clear and distinct ideas exist. They each prove each other. That's circular. That's the Cartesian circle. And it's a trap that I think he fell into. I think this is circular reasoning. There are some really sophisticated readings of Descartes that try to, fix this problem. But they are quite sophisticated, and in general, most would say that he is being very circular here. Again, he uses this notion of clear and distinct ideas to be very certain of what he knows. If it's clear, distinct, I can't deny it. Well, how do you know that God exists? Because I have a clear, distinct idea of him. Well, how do you know that clear and distinct ideas are believable? Because God wouldn't allow that. Okay, well, which one is it? Eating his cake and having it too. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, Michael. Yeah, that's what Michael said in the chat box, in case you're not reading the chat box. So, yeah, this is a big problem for him, and I think it's kind of embarrassing, to be honest with you. But let's get back to, just forget all that, right? Okay, let's just say he's got everything. He's proved that he exists. He proves that God exists. He's proved that God's not a deceiver. Let's just give him all that for the sake of argument. How is he going to get to the material world? How is he going to prove that the material world exists and that everything isn't just, thoughts in his head, right? That there's actually a tree out there. It's not just his experience of a tree. What's his argument going to be for this? And how does it, how is the difference, this distinction between the imagination and the intellect going to get us there? Well, let's see how he does this. Let's look at, again, back on page 47. I'm just going to go ahead and reread what I just read, because let's kind of start over. I think I got a little sidetracked with the clear and distinct ideas. So let's start from the top. So it remains for me to examine whether material things exist. Indeed, I now know they can exist, at least insofar as they are the object of a pure mathematics, and since I clearly and distinctly perceive them. For no doubt God is capable of bringing about everything that I'm capable of perceiving in this way, and I've never judged that God was incapable of something except when it was incompatible with my perceiving it distinctly. Moreover, from the faculty of imagination, which I notice that I use while dealing with material things, it seems to follow that they exist. So he's saying here, when I think about the imagination and what I mean by that, what the imagination is, I see that I use it when I'm dealing with material things. And if I think about the way it is employed and the way it's used in those experiences, I will see that that leads credence, or that provides evidence for the fact that there are actual material things. Okay, this is all very vague and abstractly stated. It would be helpful if he gave us an example here to demonstrate his point. And he does this, to be fair. He does this at the bottom of 47, he begins. So what does he mean by the imagination? And how is it that the imagination is always employed or used when I'm trying to deal with what we call material things, what we assume to be physical stuff that's existing external to our mind, external to our experience? He writes at the bottom there, this is the second paragraph, to make this clear, I first examined the difference between imagination and pure intellection. Okay, so he's going to distinguish between what's imagination and what you might call intellection, the intellect, the mind, reasoning, understanding. He seems to use these terms synonymously. It's not clear. Sometimes they seem to have a special meaning. Sometimes they seem to mean the same thing. But what is the difference? He says, well, when I imagine a triangle, so this is the imagination, when I imagine the triangle, I not only understand that it is a figure bounded by 3 lines, but at the same time I envisage with the mind's eye those lines as if they were present. This is what I call imagining. So imagining, if I'm imagining a triangle in this case, I not only have an understanding, but I also have a visualization, right? I know that it's a figure. I know that a triangle is a figure that has 3 sides. I know all that about it, but I'm actually picturing the darn thing. I'm picturing a freaking triangle in my head, 3 sides and all the good stuff. On the other hand, if I want to think about a Chiliagon, I had no idea what a Chiliagon was either. Maybe you did, but I never heard of one until I read Descartes, okay? When I try to understand, or when I try to think about a Chiliagon, I certainly understand that it is a figure consisting of 1,000 sides. Yet I do not imagine that those 1,000 sides, or I don't imagine those 1,000 sides in the same way, or envisage them as if they were present, the way he did with the triangle. And although in that case, like if I tried to imagine a Chiliagon, because of the force of habit, I always imagine something whenever I think of a shape or a corporeal thing. I may perchance represent to myself some figure in some confused fashion, but nevertheless, this figure is obviously not a Chiliagon. Okay, so a Chiliagon, you can't picture a Chiliagon in your head, can you? You can try. Can you picture a 1,000-sided shape? If I did, I've tried it. I'm just picturing a circle or like a bunch of ridges, just this blurry circular. It's not 1,000 distinct sides, but I understand what that means to have 1,000 sides. So my understanding, what he's calling here my intellection, can understand the Chiliagon, but my imagination never touches it. It never comes close. So certainly the imagination is something distinct and different from the intellect. They're different, they're separate, and it seems like the imagination is always tied to something with shape, with physicality, with extension, something visual, and the intellect is simply something just understood. He says, this is the next paragraph on 48, page 48. It's that second full paragraph. He says, I consider that this power of imagining that is in me, insofar as it differs from the power of understanding, is not required for my own essence, that is the essence of my mind. For if I were to be lacking this power, if he couldn't imagine things, I would nevertheless undoubtedly remain the same entity I am. Thus it seems to follow that the power of imagining depends upon something distinct from me. Okay? What's he saying here? Well, I don't need imagination to be the kind of thing that I am. What kind of thing is he? I think I've already said it 3 or 4 times in this lecture, so if you were paying close attention, you probably already heard it once, but I want to hear it from you. What does he think he is? He's like, I know I'm a thing, but what kind of thing am I? What do I do? I'm a thing that does what? Yes.
Thinking
Yeah.
thing.
I'm a thinking thing. Very technical term. Yeah, but very academic. Yeah, I'm a thinking thing. I'm a thing that thinks. Thing that I doubt, I understand, I misunderstand, I imagine, I have senses. But he says the imagination, and later on he's going to say even the senses, are not essential to a thinking thing. In order to be a thinking thing, I don't need an imagination. I don't need to be able to picture things in my head, like a triangle or any other shape. And I don't even need senses. He hasn't said that yet, but he will. I'm actually gonna skip a lot because the Meditation 6 is very long and drawn out. So I'm abbreviating it quite a bit, to be honest. So for those of you who are writing your paper, you can look at the details, especially if you're gonna write about Meditation 6. But I have to say, this is probably the main point on which I really don't want to follow Descartes, and I really don't agree with him. I feel like I must have a bit of a personal bias here because of some of my other philosophical influences. But this claim he's saying, basically, that if I consider the power of imagining, insofar as it's different from my understanding, it's not required for my essence. That is the essence of my mind. For if I were lacking this power, I would nevertheless undoubtedly remain the same entity that I am now. I don't agree. I don't agree. I really don't think that if you took away, just do a little thought experiment. If you took away all your senses and you had no senses at all, taste, touch, smell, nothing, and you didn't even have an imagination, you didn't have the ability to think of shapes and imagine things in your head, what would you be thinking of?
I mean, does he include because I know we're talking about senses like taste, touch, hearing, smelling, but like does he just I guess you're right. Like if you can't see, then what are you thinking about? It's like when you ask people who are blind, you describe color to them, and they can't comprehend what you're talking about.
Yeah,
So yeah, I guess you're right.
yeah, I'm kind of with that. Has anybody in here ever been in a sensory deprivation tank? It's pretty rare. It's kind of a niche, eccentric thing to do. It's becoming more popular now, though. I think like Joe Rogan talks about it all the time. So it's
Like,
becoming, but a sensory deprivation tank. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a. Sometimes you lay down in them, but sometimes you can float upright. But they're filled with water. You go inside this thing. It's you're closed off. You're shut off. It's like a closet basically, where you float in water. And it's completely dark, so you can't see any light at all. It's soundproof. I guess smell-proof, you can't smell. And the water, once you sit in the water for, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes, the temperature of the water adapts to your body temperature so that you can't even feel your body. So you don't even have tactile senses. So what do you think happens to people that go into these sensory deprivation tanks?
they get anxious. I mean, some people use it to meditate, to block off everything, but a lot of times a sensory that could make you anxious.
Yeah, and usually your mind reacts. Your mind reacts
in ways. Insane. You can go insane being sensory.
Yeah,
they use that as torture.
Yeah, I had a student last class, we were talking about this. She says, that sounds traumatic, you know, but I'm kind of more like of the meditative school. I'm like, well, I meditate, and when you meditate, this is exactly what you try to do. You try to, you know, not focus on anything, you know, it's impossible. You're always going to feel something, but you try to not let it, you know, just sort of let it flow through and not focus on it or something like that. Um, but the typical experience of most people is they don't freak out. Usually they
Right,
start
clears up.
seeing stuff. They start hallucinating. And maybe if they didn't hallucinate, they would freak out. I think the mind is so used to inputs. When there are no inputs, it fills them in. It has to have them. I was listening to an interview recently with a neuroscientist who was talking about, she thinks that she has this theory for why we have dreams, and it might have to do her. I mean, I don't know the technical terminology, but apparently there is a system of or a network of neurons, a neural network in your brain that is specifically its specific function is to basically organize all the sense data that comes in. So I mean, at every moment, you're getting an infinite amount. I mean, thousands and millions of bits of information are arriving in your mind, basically. I mean, there's so many things. I mean, I could focus on. I could focus on all the little lines in the wall. I mean, I could focus on every little spot on my desk. But no, I focus on my computer screen and trying to explain Descartes because there's a mechanism in my brain that kind of filters out stuff. You know, it kind of assesses the situation. How is this like previous experiences? How did the brain react and organize? And it sort of is a decision mechanism. It helps us make choices and eliminate all the feedback and focus on or not the feedback, the distortion and all the sort of extraneous stuff, and focus on what's important. And her theory about dreams is that when we're asleep, that part of the mind is sort of at rest. It's not as active. And so sort of all the inputs and all the memories and all the sense data that we've collected that we weren't really paying attention to is just sort of thrown at us in sleep. And so that's where dreams come in. And we see all sorts of, she said something similar about psychedelics. She said that she thinks, and she has, again, she says that's not her specialty, but she's just surmising from her knowledge of the brain that when we're doing psychedelics, if you've ever done psilocybin or something, that's basically what it does. It relaxes or cuts off that part of your brain that focuses on one thing and sort of decides, you know, what you're going to focus on. So, but to me, and again, I'm trying to bring it back to Descartes, I think he's got this very naive notion of the mind that, and I think what he would say, the question I was asking you all earlier, if you had no senses and you had no imagination, then what the heck would you be thinking? Descartes' answer, I think, would be about math. I would be thinking about quantity, mathematics, geometrical truth, my own thought, God. Those things I don't need the senses and I don't need imagination for. But I don't agree. I don't agree. I don't think
That's kind of ridiculous though,
Yeah.
because how does he? What? So if he never had the senses, if he is he talking as if if all his senses died out now or before? Because in order
Right.
to experience mathematics and religion, he had to be able to hear and see and and touch, like, you know, practical items in order to do mathematics.
Right.
If he never if he never experienced that through his senses, his imagination would have no sense of reference.
Yeah, I think that he's not clear, to answer your question. He's not clear, but I would assume he means that the first, right? That even if you'd never had it, not that you lost it now, but even if you'd never had a sense and never had an imagination, you would still have thought. And yeah, I'm with you. I think no. Even math, like how would you ever think of quantities or numbers if you were just thought and thought itself? What would you be thinking of? You wouldn't have an encounter with one or two things or three things, or there'd be nothing to measure. There'd be nothing to count. There'd be no, you know, so I think he's got this very naive, here's where I think it's coming from. I think it's, you know, we often have this experience ourselves when we know what we know what we mean. We have this thing we want to say, but we're at a loss for words. So we have the understanding, we just don't know how to articulate it. We don't know how to put it into words. And so, but to me, that still is a feeling. There's still a visceral feeling. It's tied to a body. It's a reaction to an environment. I'm going to borrow from Heidegger. Heidegger is a German philosopher, and he didn't say this, but many of his followers, the scholars who study him, they formulate his critique. Heidegger had a big critique of Descartes. He was very critical of Descartes, and certainly on this point, Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am." But what Heidegger teaches us is no, I am, and therefore I think. What we call the mind, what we call the self, is a product of our interaction with being, with what is, with the world. We're thrown into the world, we interact with things, and then all of our notions of a self, of thought, are a sort of congregation or a constellation or a confluence of all those influences. And so if you take away everything, if you take away the world, there's no self left. You know, what do we mean by a mind? What do we mean by a self? There's always content.
I think,
go ahead.
yeah, I think Heidegger has it right.
Yeah.
Because Descartes his thing is always about certainty, but he says like, I think, therefore I am, but thinking isn't certain about anything. Like, yeah, I just the whole kind of like when you swap it, and now he's like, I am, therefore I think.
Right.
So like you can only think if you exist. You can only
Right.
think if you are a sense of self.
And thought develops later, really. For Heidegger's going to argue that, you know, your normal mode of being, you're not thinking about yourself. You're kind of lost. You're kind of like, you just go about your day. You're not constantly like, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. You just do it, you know? It's not until like, you know, you're like Mr. Descartes in your study, and you're like, you know, here I am writing this essay. What is it that I am? And like, you're calmly like, you know, taking stock of all your beliefs. But that's a very artificial way of going about your day. Most of us just, there really is no self. We just are our experience. And so thought is something that develops, Heidegger would say, in response to that. And this is very similar to the Buddhist critique of the self. If anyone's familiar at all with Buddhist philosophy, you know, most forms of Buddhism, not all of them, but most forms, the majority of them, they reject the notion of a self, that you have a permanent self or a permanent soul. And so this is what Descartes kind of relying on this belief that we all have, that, well, we've got this thing called a soul, and it's just, that's it. Like that's the essence of us. And for the Buddha, you know, there's a famous discourse where the Buddha is asked by one of his disciples, where does my soul go when it dies? And the Buddha says, that question does not apply. And the disciple, what do you mean it doesn't apply? He's like, that's like asking where that fire goes when it goes out. You see that fire over there? And if it goes out, where does it go? Does it go north? Does it go east, south, west? Does it go up or down? No, it's just gone. And so the Buddha uses this as an analogy. The self, what we call ourself, our thoughts and all this, are dependent on all these other factors. In fact, this is a key teaching of Buddhism. Everything, not just ourself, but everything is dependent on other things. And when those other things change, the self changes, just like the fire. When there's not enough firewood, when the fire burns out, right? When the wood burns into ashes, there's no longer kindling, there's no longer enough oxygen, there's no longer enough fuel. When all those things dissipate, so does the fire. The self is the same way. Whenever our connection to the world disappears, our dreams, our hopes, our desires, our experiences, the people that we know, the society that we grew up in, if all that is gone, what's left? Nothing. Just a name, Travis, self, mind. It's empty. There's nothing there, you know. But Descartes is very insistent that there is. Yeah, that I don't need physical existence. I have it. He says, I do believe that my mind is tied to a body, but I could exist without a body. I would still be a thinking thing, even if I didn't have a body, even if I wasn't tied to any physical existence. And this is something that I'm pretty darn critical. I think he's completely wrong about this. And honestly, I think it's one of his worst errors. As embarrassing as some of his proofs for God's existence are, I really think that this error is one that has unfortunately haunted the history of philosophy since Descartes, and I think that people are still getting over it. And so I'm going to go ahead again and let him have it, okay? Where's he going with this? Let's just say he's right, and that the mind is independent of the body. You don't need a body. You don't need senses. You don't need imagination. If all those were gone, thought would still remain. Okay, so how does this get us to the existence of physical things? How does this get us to the existence of the physical world? Well, he says, well, I'm a thinking thing, and that's essential to me. Having a body is not. When I'm thinking of material things, I use my imagination, and that is dealing with things that are akin to a body. They're akin to a body, not akin to thought. Material things, it's not essential that they think. It's essential that they're extended. It's essential, but it's not essential that they think. So whatever's causing them had to come from somewhere outside of me. Doesn't depend on me. So what is the cause of it? What is the cause of me experiencing a tree? Why do I think I see a tree? Is there really a tree out there? He wants to say yes, but he doesn't know yet. So now we finally get to his argument. Now how's he going to prove that the tree exists out there? This comes after several pages of him explaining the interaction between the mind and the body, and that the mind is familiar with the body because of these various reasons, that the mind is separate from the body, and the body depends on the mind, but not the other way around. I'm skipping all that stuff so we can get to the essence of his argument, and we can finally get to the material world, and we can know that material objects exist, and sort of wrap things up here. I'm going to leave a lot of the issues that are still unresolved. I'm going to leave some of these issues about the distinction in the mind and the body. I'll leave those for next meeting. But let's look at this argument. How is he going to get, with all that's been said so far about the intellect, about the imagination, about the distinction between that and the body, how is he going to get to this argument that things that are physical are real, and they're not in me, they're actually out there, and they are more or less as I experience them? This is on page 52. So like I said, we're skipping quite a bit. So if you go to page 52 of our text, it's about a third of the way down the page. He writes, now there is clearly in me a passive faculty of sensing. That is, a faculty for receiving and knowing the ideas of sensible things. But I could not use it unless there existed also, either in me or in something else, a certain faculty of producing or bringing about these ideas. So obviously I have senses, obviously I have experiences, and so they must be caused by something. They must be caused by something in me or something external to me. But this faculty surely cannot be in me, since it clearly presupposes no active understanding, and these ideas are produced without my cooperation and often even against my will. So it doesn't involve thought. I don't have to think to see the tree. It's just there, and it's there whether I want to or not. So that's good evidence that it's not caused by me. Although, if you remember, he argued against this earlier, thought this was a bad reason. So now he's using the same argument that he rejected earlier. I think that's a bit fishy. But he says the only alternative, and there's really two alternatives, right? The only alternative is one of these two things. Either that there's some substance that's different from me, containing either formally or immanently all the reality that exists objectively in the ideas that are produced by the faculty, as I've just noted above, and hence substance is either a body, that is a corporeal nature, which contains formally all that is contained objectively, like there's actually all that, everything that's objectively in my mind, the way I'm experiencing it, is somehow in the object to some degree. Or, and here's the second alternative, or else it is God or some other creature more noble than a body, which contains immanently all that is contained objectively in the ideas. So what's he basically saying here? When I have an experience of the tree, either there's actually a tree out there, there's actually some object that's causing me to have an experience, or what's the other alternative? There is nothing out there. It's all just thoughts in my mind. I didn't create them, but what did, or who did? So so this substance is either a body that is acorporeal nature, or else it is God or some other creature which contains all that is contained objectively in the ideas. So what's he saying there? No, it's very convoluted the way he explains it, but so either there really are physical objects out there, and they are more or less as I experience them, not perfect, but close, or else there really aren't. Everything's just like a dream in my mind. Anybody, what are the two? So either there really are, and he's going to go with the first one. He's going to say for sure that's it. There really are material things out there, and the ideas or the representations I have of them do resemble the actual physical things. That's what he's going to go with. He's going to go with the first alternative. What's the second alternative, though, that he's proposing here?
I mean,
I'll read the sentence again. I'll read it more slowly. All right. This substance is either a body that is a corporeal nature, which contains formally, and what he means by formally, like it actually has all these qualities. It contains formally all that is contained objectively, like in my head, you know, all these things, right? So it's either there's actually a thing out there, or else it is God or some other creature more noble than a body which contains eminently all that is contained in the ideas. So either there's a thing out there or else what?
I guess, or else he's living in some kind of purgatory.
The word purgatory is getting close to the answer to the question. Okay, I guess, I don't know. The word God is not obvious enough. He says, or else it's God. Or else it's God. Okay, either it's a body or else it's God. Okay, maybe I should have read slower. I don't know. But okay, either there's really a body out there, actually a body, there's actually a tree, and when I see a tree, there's actually a freaking tree, or there's no such thing. There's nothing external to me. It's all in my mind. Everything's in my mind.
Mm.
And he's established that not everything I experience is caused by me. Not everything I experience is caused by me. I can't help whether I see that tree or not. I'm not causing it. I look over there, there's a freaking tree. So, and I think it's external. I want to believe it's external. I have a strong compulsion and instinct to believe it's actually there. Okay. So I want to believe it. But perhaps it's just God. God is putting all these ideas in my head. There is no external world. And it's all just, you know, when I see a tree and I think it's a real tree, when I look at my desk and I think it's a real desk, it's really just in my head. It's really just in my mind. God is just presenting these images to me. Why doesn't he like... Yeah, go ahead.
So does that mean that in that sense, our bodies is just something else, like something else that's just...
Right. So everything physical, everything physical is not real. Mind and thought is all that's real, and God just makes us think it's real, and he creates all these images. Yeah, and Descartes, he rejects that. He's like, that can't be the case. No way. It's got to be the first alternative. It's got to be there's really things out there, and they resemble the way I see them. But why? Why would he not like the second? Why is that less plausible that God is, you know, making us see all the things that we see when in reality they don't even exist at all. They're just thoughts in our head. Why would he reject that hypothesis?
I mean, I guess he would.
Well,
But
there's something about God that he thinks he's already established that precludes this possibility.
oh, like that God, like, oh, basically he would assume that God is just messing with us. Like the second one
Right.
assumes some kind of nefarious nature
Exactly.
to
He
the.
says, I mean, wouldn't that be pretty deceptive? I mean, I don't think anybody in
Yes,
here doubt. Yeah, most of us, I mean, I could be wrong. Feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong about this. But I'm pretty sure everybody here believes that material things exist. You know, when you look outside, you believe that that car driving by is real, that it's actually out there, right? And so I think Descartes is saying we all have that feeling. And if God made us, and he thinks God did, he believes that God created us, he made us to think that, that's pretty tricky. Like you said, it's pretty nefarious. And that's beneath God's nature. God would not be a deceiver. We've already established that. So certainly the first alternative has to be the correct one. It can't be, you know, it's all just in my head and it's all, you know, God makes me think it's real, but it's really just, you know, thoughts. That's absurd, he says, right? He says, since God is not a deceiver, it's patently obvious that he does not send me these ideas either immediately by himself or even through the mediation of some creature that contains, you know, part of the reality that the ideas contain. For since God has given me no faculty whatsoever for making this determination, but has instead given me a great inclination to believe that these ideas do issue from. So God, you know, if God is my creator, he made me have an instinct to believe that that wall is real and that I can't walk through it. We all feel this way. We have a natural instinct. So if he made us have an instinct to believe it and it was false, that'd be pretty deceptive. So Descartes rejects it. Interestingly enough, another philosopher that we'll talk about next class, a guy named Berkeley, don't worry about his name yet, he thinks this is actually right. He actually thinks that there is no external world, that it is all just thoughts, that everything that exists in a mind, either in my mind or your mind or God's mind, and he sees no problem with that. Doesn't see it as deceptive at all. I think I heard somebody try to jump in. Somebody trying to ask something?
It's like what we are told.
I'm having a tough time hearing you. Let me see if I can turn up my volume.
I don't know.
Oh, I think your microphone is not working or something. It's cutting off. You might try, Danielle, you might try typing in your question or typing in your comment, because I don't think your microphone is quite working. Sorry about that. Jeez. I'm gonna keep talking, but if you want to, I'm gonna be staring at that chat box. So if you want to type something in, go ahead and I'll address it that way. But yeah, like oddly enough, Berkeley doesn't see any problem with this. He actually thinks that to be is to be perceived, and what perceives is a mind, and so all perceptions are in the mind, and there's nothing external to the mind, and so everything is either in my mind or your mind or God's mind, and there's nothing deceptive about that. So we'll talk a little bit more about him next class, but I think it's kind of interesting that he sees no problem with it. But Descartes says, no, that's deceptive. I mean, you're basically making God the evil genius, and that's beneath the goodness and the greatness of God. And so obviously it must be the first alternative. So he's saying that saying that what we see is based on what God has put into our minds. No, not exactly. Berkeley is saying that. If you're referring to Berkeley, yes. All right, Berkeley, yes. Descartes, no. I can only just spell Berkeley. Yeah, so Berkeley's going to be like, yeah, it is all just thoughts in our head. But Descartes would say, no, that's too tricky. God did create everything. Descartes believes that, but he made physical stuff. He made the tree, he made the earth, he made and those things are real, and they exist external to us. And so now he's happy. And pretty much you could argue this is really the effective end of his meditations. He's gotten away from doubting everything to knowing that he exists, to knowing that not only he exists, but a perfect God exists that's not deceptive. And now he knows that the material world exists. But he turns to one last problem, one last issue that he has to resolve. And you might be thinking, when I tell you what this issue is, you might be thinking, hasn't he already resolved it? But he has to figure out, well, if this is the case, then why do I still make mistakes? What is the source of my error? You know, why is it that sometimes I look at a tree and I think it's a tree, but it's actually a cardboard cutout of a tree? It just looks real. So you know, you might say, well, didn't he answer this earlier? Didn't he say that we make mistakes because we have free will, and free will allows us to extend our judgments beyond our understanding? And certainly, yeah, but maybe you might say this is a different mistake. This is a mistake of our senses, that it's a peculiar type. And so he says, if God designed us in such a way that we more or less have an accurate view of the world, how is it possible that we still make mistakes? And he gives this example of dropsy. And I got to admit, I didn't know what dropsy was before I read Descartes. I had no idea what this condition was, but apparently when you have dropsy, you're very thirsty, your mouth is parched, but you're not supposed to drink. It's actually very bad for you. You're not supposed to drink anything. And so Descartes says, well, how does that, why is that? You know, usually when your mouth is parched and you're thirsty, you should drink. So why is there this communication between your body and the mind? Why is this sometimes good and sometimes bad? What is the source of the error? And basically, essentially, the way that he tries to explain this is that there's a chain reaction. There's a sort of, I hate to call it a chain of causation, but he gives the example of feeling a pain in the foot. You know, and he uses this sort of, you know, these capital letters A, B, C, and D. There's a whole chain of events that communicates the pain in the foot to my mind. You know, let's just say that, you know, something, you know, my toe stubs something hard and it hurts, right? So the physical contact happens. That is communicated through my nerves, and it goes up my nerves, that's B, I guess, and reaches my brain, that's C. And then the brain understands, you know, it gets the signal, and then D, the foot moves away, right, and goes youch, right, and I react, and my physical body is recoiled. And so, I mean, this process takes a millisecond. It happens in a flash, but there are all these steps, A, B, C, and D. And what Descartes is saying is that in these situations where, let's say, I have dropsy and I have a dry mouth and I feel thirsty, even though I shouldn't drink, you know, that there's a miscommunication. Perhaps one of these intermediate parts, like B and C, is giving me a signal and communicating something to D when really nothing's happening at the end, right? So there's some sort of turbulence, some sort of, something in the middle that's causing the communication of one to the other to be distorted, and my mind picks up something wrong. So if we go back to this picture, the cartoon we keep referring back to, you know, sometimes there's an actual tree out there. Rays of light will bounce off the tree and go into my eye. Okay, then my eye will process it and send signals to my brain. My brain will sort of pick up on the fact that I'm looking at a tree, and that's a representation of the tree in my mind. Okay, but occasionally I make a mistake. That, you know, something will trigger the same chain reaction, but it'll be based on something false, like something like a cardboard cutout of the tree. You know, I'll see a cardboard cutout that looks very realistic and it's far away. And so, same thing, light will reflect off that cardboard cutout, send signals to my brain. I will assume that, oh, there's a tree out there. And then I'll think it's a tree. I'm wrong. It's a cardboard cutout of a tree. So that's all there is to this. But then you might still think, well, then why didn't God make me so that this sort of thing didn't happen? You know, why do I still make these errors? You know, you've told me how they happen, that there's this sort of, you know, failure somewhere along the chain of causation. And so from the signal to its transmission in my mind, there's some sort of distortion. But why does God allow this to happen? And Descartes, I think his basic answer to this is, well, geez, I'm made out of matter. and I'm a material thing, and I'm finite. And, you know, that means I'm not perfect. So I should actually be thankful to God because, yeah, sure, I make mistakes. But if, as we notice from the examples, they're the exception, not the rule. Usually when I have a dry throat, when I'm parched, I should drink. And usually when I see something that looks very much like a tree, it usually is a tree. It's only in these very odd cases. So generally the communication between my body and my mind is pretty accurate, especially, he says, when it regards my health and my well-being. It's not perfect, but it's good in most cases. And ultimately for Descartes, if we want to be sure that there's going to be a correspondence between the thing that we're seeing and our experience of it, we have to be careful with our assertions, and we have to stick strictly to mathematical reasoning, quantitative, geometrical reasoning. That will make sure that our errors are eliminated, or at least lessened. All right, there'll be less errors if we focus. You know, you might think back to his example of the sun. When I look at the sun, it appears a lot closer to me than it is. It appears a lot smaller than it is. I need to think about my experience of it and extract the mathematical truths from it, and then that will get me to the thing itself and what the actual object, what the sun actually is like. Okay, there's still a lot more to say about Descartes, but I just have a feeling that we covered so much ground already today. There's so much in the sixth meditation. So I'm actually going to stop here. We're going to stop a little bit early. It's short class today. But for next meeting, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap everything up with the modern period of philosophy. We're going to talk about some other modern philosophers and start to finally segue into more contemporary philosophy with Jean-Paul Sartre. So we'll hear about some more other rationalists besides Descartes. We'll hear some alternative theories from some British empiricists. And then we'll even talk a little bit about Immanuel Kant, who is a very, very influential figure during this time period. And he also spoke a bit about ethics, which will be the focus of the next reading. So for those of you who do not have the next reading, we're not going to start it till Tuesday, so not till next week. So you still got a ways to go. But please get a copy of this as soon as you can. Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism. Try to read as much of it as you can by Tuesday. And don't forget, your Descartes essay is due next week. It will be due a week from this Thursday, so October 29th. So with all that, I guess I'll end the meeting, and if you want to leave, you're free to go, but I'll stick around, and if you want to ask me any questions, I'll be here for, I don't know, 30, 45 seconds, maybe longer. Looks like somebody does have a question. How many pages do you have to have for the paper? The standard for this class, 2 to 3 pages. You might be a little bit longer on the final, maybe 3 or 4 pages, but 2 to 3 pages, double space, 12-point font. That's the basic rule of thumb. All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay. Look, yeah. Yeah. Did you have something?
Oh, I said no, sir.
Oh, no. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Well, you guys have a good day, and I will see you on Thursday. Cheers.